both Neil and Michael in interviews for the second book, which I'll talk about tonight, which is coming out here.
I'll do it.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Good evening. I'm Ron Whitty, Associate Professor of Architecture at the School of Architecture at Rice. On behalf of the Rice Design Alliance, I welcome you to the second lecture of the RDA Fall Lecture Series, A Material World. The RDA would also like to thank the School of Architecture at Rice and Dean Sarah Whiting, I hear she's good, for their continued support. And the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for the use of this great space. It's terrific actually to speak that way from this podium. I also want to thank tonight's pre-lecture reception sponsor, D.E. Harvey Builders. Please take a moment to view the list of sponsors for tonight's lecture. Much appreciated, all the support that the RDA gets from all those named on the screen. As a courtesy to our speaker, please silence your cell phones and do not use flash photography, or use really, really flashy photography. After the lecture, there's going to be a book signing just outside the auditorium where Gail's publication, Material Precedent, will be on sale. The series continues next week with Material Connections' David Gresham and concludes on October 27th with John Fernandez. Finally, on November 13th, the RDA annual Gala fundraising event will honor longtime Harris County engineer Art Story. For more information on all of the RDA's future programs, please see their website, www.ricedesignalliance.org. That was part one of the introduction. Ooh, good. Architects draw things. It doesn't matter much whether drawing means using a pencil or using a computer. Drawing is drawing. We like to think we draw because we like to draw. The fact is, we have to draw. If we're lucky, we draw because of both. Architects produce tangible things out of the volatile vapor of ideas. Unlike car salesmen, we don't have the luxury of giving people tires to kick, engines to listen to, radios to turn on and off. We give you a different kind of thing to kick, potential. Potential comes about when the mist of ideas is distilled and activated through design. Partly intellectual, partly functional, partly visual, design is always drawn. Drawings are how we test drive architecture. They're how we kick architecture. They're how we speculate about architecture. They're how we seduce you into spending $10 million on architecture. They're how we seduce ourselves into making the world better. Drawings are how we wear our good and bad ideas on our sleeves. Drawings are how architects talk to the public and how we gossip among ourselves. Nothing holds more potential than a blank computer screen, sitting in front of you like a black hole into which you're supposed to dive. Of course, there are two ways to approach that black hole. The first presumes that it is empty, a terrifying, more often than not, paralyzing capitulation to the hazy chasm below. The second starts with the premise that that hole is full, even overflowing with architectures. When it comes to drawings, Gail Borden is a screen-full kind of diver. I first encountered Gail when he was a graduate student at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. I walked into Piper Auditorium, a room that seats several hundred people and normally holds four actually, simultaneous reviews. I was about to sit on a jury for Gail's thesis review, his final review at the GSD. Gail had taken over the entire hall. It was a representational invasion of Normandy, a D-Day, drawing day, unlike anything I'd ever seen at the GSD or anywhere else for that matter. These were drawings that rewrote our sense of the American house. They recast the suburbs into a series of prototypical experiments. In other words, these drawings were embodiments of a screen full of architectural aspirations. In the space of an hour or so, I was made aware of Gail's extraordinary talents as a draftsman, which I mean in the most complimentary sense. But beyond that is somebody who masterfully uses drawings to advance architecture as a whole, as ideas, as buildings, as urbanism, as material, and in the end, as potential. Before getting his master's degree from the GSD, Gail attended Rice, where he wasn't happy with one, he received 3 degrees. A Bachelor of Architecture, a Bachelor of Fine Arts, a Bachelor of Art History, all cum laude. That's a lot of cum laude. Gail is currently an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, the School of Architecture there. He's previously taught at North Carolina State and at the Catholic University of America. This year, Gail published Material Precedent, The Typology of Modern Tectonics. He co-edited Material Matters in 2009. He was included in Expanding Architecture, edited by Brian Bell in 2008. That's just a few of the places where his work has been published. His work has appeared in journals throughout the U.S. Gail's work has been exhibited in France, Marfa, one's a city, one's a nation, Florida, New York, North Carolina, and China, among other places. Gail has a long list of awards, including a Fulbright grant, the Borchardt Fellowship, a Young Architects Forum Award, and a Chinati Foundation residency, among others. Please join me in welcoming Gail Borden.
Great. Well, that was a wonderful introduction. That'll be the highlight of the evening, I assure you. So, yes, we can dim the lights so everybody can digest their appetizers, and I can talk a little bit about a lecture that I've never given this lecture before. It's very specifically kind of crafted for this lecture series. And I'd like to actually, let me back up and let me thank everybody for their kind of tremendous hospitality. I want to thank the Rice Design Alliance for a really great lecture series and a kind of tremendous kind of hospitality. University of Houston, and Donna and Catherine, everybody who's been a wonderful host, Sarah and Ron for the introduction. But I'd actually really like to just thank, in general, the architectural community in Houston as a city. Every time I come back, I have a very warm feeling and a tremendous kind of optimism for the energy and the life that exists here. And I really count it among one of my many homes in the world, and it's really great to be back. So, as I was saying, this lecture tries to really position, I think, my thoughts and my work in a lot of different veins, from practice, from teaching, which I won't really talk about so much, from publication, but all relative to the role of materiality and the ideal of materiality as, I think, a new theme that is framing my generation of practitioners, and one that through technology, through our kind of position in history, and through, I think, the ideas of how we have a real need to think through making, how materiality has foregrounded itself as something that is really kind of essential. So I like this picture because it's very much about a kind of cause and effect, a kind of reaction, but it implies so many kind of systems, from fluid dynamics to biology to instinct, but creates a kind of transitional moment that is energetic and exciting. And for me, that's what materiality does. It's that piece of steak in a way. So, what is materiality? I think it's something that ultimately architects have to frame in a very personal way, because it's almost become a little bit of an overused term in terms of what it means. From material scientists to kind of material archivists to simply any practicing architect has to deal with the idea of the physicality of things. But how can that tactility and that actuality of matter come into play as a design process and a collaborator in the way that we think about how we make things? So material for me, in a way, it's material, but it's process. It's aggregation. It's clearly geometry and patterning. It's tectonics in the broad sense of what that is, and all that, I think, adds up to kind of equal making. So I wanted to start by trying to go through some kind of ground or foundational themes, I think, that are my attempt to try and step back and begin to kind of pick up on a series of murmurs or underlying whispers, I think, in the profession. They're not meant to be glib as titles, and they're not meant to be isolationist in terms of trying to categorize people in a specific way, but rather begin to think of attitudes, I think, philosophies, and conceptual underpinnings towards that idea of how you deal with material. So, resistance. To me, at the fundamental level, right, how we engage material, there's this battle, there's this resistance between the physical properties of how things are made and the intellectual intention behind what we're trying to make. And for me, this kind of series of slides, I like, on the left is a steel piece, in the middle is an inflatable, right, Darth Vader's head, and on the right is a little kind of plastic thermoformed doll. But the kind of formality, right, in the end, there's obviously some kind of similarities, but the energy and the difficulty in the process to arrive at these diverse endpoints has a kind of dramatically different sensibility. And that idea about how we engage the physical, I think, is fundamental. It's embedded in our ideas about sustainability. It's embedded in ideas about fabrication and about understanding how things are made and how we culturally embody that making process in the final artifact itself. So to go back to the kind of beginning, the kind of touchstone in a way, right? I think modernism was a moment, a kind of perfect kind of crossroads of technology, of a new idea about space and form, about a translation of abstract principles into very specific ideas. And so obviously the kind of Barnett-Newman-Miesian juxtaposition is a kind of overt one. Standing on the shoulders of that, right, I think modernism and some of its utopian ideals had shortcomings, and that got filled in maybe with a kind of postmodern desire to return to history and to return to ornamentation and referentiality to begin to find a sense of meaning and a sense of iconography for how to make architecture. But somewhere in there, the idea about materiality became very much a sort of slave in many ways. It became a subordination that was necessary, but often sort of artificially proposed. I think in response to that, there was a generation that became much less interested in form, right? I mean, we can look at, I think, Herzog and de Meuron and the kind of simplicity in their earlier work, the simplicity of the overarching geometries that they're using for the primary form, and then the sophistication and complexity that they're starting to embed into the material itself. So suddenly the desire was not necessarily for a traditional representation of history, but for an effectual idea. And that idea being one that's performative, one that's made through innovation in terms of the process of photo etching concrete or how a kind of complicated fin system is actually articulated. But the idea of full field geometry, of a dissolution of referentiality and a movement towards a kind of complexity through the material itself, I think, began to establish a new kind of wave. I think on top of that now, the issue of sustainability. I took this when I was in Beijing giving a lecture just before the Beijing Olympics opened, and I thought it was kind of a perfect thing, right? The idea of sustainability, but it's linked back to the form, right? Obviously, the kind of reference to the bird's nest, and I think in a way that the kind of high-tech nature of the role of performative skins and of generative systems that can actually now begin to reinsert themselves into the kind of conversation have a kind of new wave, but here one still kind of too referential perhaps in its form. So where does that leave us, right? That kind of leaves us at this sort of tortured moment, right? I like these two images. On the left and on the right, we're kind of propelled out into space. We don't know what we're kind of doing. And, what does an emerging architect, a kind of young architect that stands on the shoulders of all this kind of history and practice and kind of thought about what architecture is, begin to do? So, process. I think process becomes a kind of touchstone. One that is really essential as a generator for the product itself. And as such, I think the idea of how we choreograph process, the way in which we design process, in fact, becomes an equal kind of collaborator to the artifact that is ultimately the resultant. On the left, I love this photograph. This is a C-section happening, and that's the hand kind of popping out. A kind of biological process that has complexities beyond our kind of comprehension in terms of how all of that actually occurs and works with such kind of regularity and ease as it does. And on the right, the kind of cockpit, the idea of all these decisions, that as architects, when we sit down at that drawing table, we all have the same set of decisions. It's just what switch do we go to first? What sequence do we prioritize our thinking? And how do we begin a kind of personal process of making architecture? For me, my time in Texas and my time in Marfa, the idea of land art, the idea of process as a way of making and a way of marking and a way of drawing on a large scale is very interesting in terms of Heiser. I think it comes through in people like, this is Thomas Demand, a photographer who builds all these scenes actually out of paper and then photographs them. He does these very beautiful photographs, but they deal with these social conditions, the kind of Unabomber's apartment and the kind of ubiquitous security checkpoint at the airport. But that idea of he makes this artificial object and then photographs it, and he actually destroys the object so that all you ever see is the photograph. Or this, which is a project I like very much. This is a graphic designer that actually did an annual report for a cooking company. And the report came in this kind of book, and inside the book was a smaller book. And you opened up that book and it was blank. So you then were given instructions, and you actually wrapped the book and then baked it. And when you baked it, all the words appeared. So there was this really intrinsic association, right, of what the company did to how you think about the artifact coming about. Or again, the idea of the mechanization. This is probably something you're familiar with. On the right is from a MoMA show, a drawing machine. On the left, this is a dog that's actually made out of plastic bags, and it's tied to the subway vent. So when the train goes by, it inflates and then it deflates. So, but that idea of these kinds of objects that make themselves. Pattern, the idea of intrinsic patterns that we geometrically understand, patterns that exist through natural kind of processes, patterns that we can now make more and more complex and more specific through parametric processes and kind of advanced computational mechanisms. There's ways in which we now can sort of upstage and create ourselves a way of thinking about a pattern language, and I think with materiality, because of the way in which we make things, because of our anthropomorphic dimensions, because of the dimensions of fabrication, segmentation is essential, right? We think of a building as one thing, but it's not. It's thousands and thousands of things, and the way in which we bring those things together becomes a tectonic, right? It becomes our visual and our architectural vocabulary. So, from Pollock, the idea of how we represent, to Van Gogh, the mark, the way things are made, again, goes back to process of what we do. Material here maybe is a kind of subcategory, but thinking about material in the way in which it's made, where it comes from, and the scale on which we begin to operate. A small move, right? The decision to do something on a very microcosmic scale, and its relationship to a macrocosmic scale. These images I love. This is a quarry in Italy, but you can see this is a backhoe, for example. So the scale of these things are just monumental. And you think about the kind of qualities of how things are made, and it's really dramatic. Material, too, on the kind of inversion sensibility. On the left, right, the first bookcase we all make is with our cinder blocks and our planks, except for here the cinder blocks are the planks, and the planks are made of concrete. Or this artist, which, again, like crochets breakfast, right? So that translation of what material can do when we think about our associations, be it cultural, be it experiential, and how those things can begin a kind of inversion, and how you can begin to be clever in many different ways with how they work. Material installation. These are projects on the right. This is a project by Michael Meredith of Moss, who is a classmate of mine at Harvard. And on the left, this is a sink that deals with the kind of erosion processes. It's actually CNC milled. The designer mapped how the water from the faucet would actually erode and then begin to actually mill that process. So the idea of translating natural processes into a system and letting that system become a kind of formal mechanism for making. Material premise, I mean, it's impossible to talk about, I think, materiality without talking about con in some way. I think Exeter Library becomes a quintessential example. I think it's one we are all familiar with in terms of its masonry and its concrete systems, the precision by which they begin to operate, the celebration of them as materials, and an understanding of those processes and the natural dimensions of each of those systems. And then just, those moments of like majestical kind of coordination where the concrete and brick and wood and mechanical systems all meet, and how beautifully those things integrate. Material manipulation, which again I think Corbusier and in particular the Unité is a fantastic example. Understanding that he would have in southern France in a post-war, a relatively remote small town of Marseille, a relatively unskilled labor force. He began to accept the kind of rawness of concrete and the messiness of construction, and began to embrace that and begin to think about the way in which things were made and how that process could embed itself into the surface so that the finalized object would represent the processes by which it was made. Material innovation, I think you probably heard a lot about from Blaine last week, and I think we'll hear even more about next week from Material Connection. But the idea of using materials, new materials or referential materials, here this is a Louis Sarmaki Lewis project, a small coffee house in New York where they use the coffee lids and the liners of the coffee cups themselves to actually make the screening systems. A relatively well-known and older project. Material fabrication, which really thinks about the way in which we deliver projects. Kieran Timberlake in their refabricating architecture, the way in which the house as their example, but I think a larger infrastructure of construction can be redelivered, using techniques of prefabrication and really beginning to customize the house into very specific ways of flat packing and unitization and reconceptualizing systems. Material irreverence, which I don't say in a bad way, but because I actually love Richard Meyer and his work, and he actually has an exquisite sensibility towards how he does material, but he's interested in, I think, other things, and so he privileges other elements to the formal composition because he's so masterfully sort of understood and established his palette. And so the idea, you can't really see these very well, but they say all the places that they are, from Paris to Indiana to Atlanta. That idea of a kind of ubiquitous application of materiality, regardless of program or site, because there's another agenda afoot. And I think that's equally as material as being irreverent to material as it is in being embracing of material. Material performance, or somebody like Zumthor, who again is hard to talk about materiality and not have Peter Zumthor's name come up. But in the St. Benedict's Church, where wood is taken throughout its composition, is a kind of total understanding of how it works through traditions of construction, through ideas of surface and stick, of how structure and skin begin to work, and how that material can be shaped and weathered and embraced for its natural irregularities, but also its intrinsic performative qualities, and again, to create a kind of harmonious but also a sort of total environment, all from a single material application. Material tectonic, again, kind of Zumthor, the way in which things come together, the subtlety of how things are detailed or joined, the integration of a handle or a lighting system, a total kind of synthesis of how things begin to relate. Material Process, his church, which hopefully everybody's also seen, but one that is, again, much like the Corbusier example, one that understood that this small chapel would have a relatively unskilled labor force, and so it used a process where they stacked a series of logs together and then formed the concrete around it and then burned out the logs to leave this very beautiful patina on the interior, as well as a kind of formal space to it. So really beginning to embrace the way in which things are made to result in form. And then material skin. This project I'd like to show because it's an Ondo project, but one that people don't often know, right? The exterior and then an interior, where skin is rethought of in a very different way. The unitization of the surface becomes a kind of a very objectified and effectual kind of result. And material space, which I think is the kind of last category I'll talk about. But looking at actually, this was an installation in the Rice Gallery of all places from a few years back. But using repetitive fields here, these are very simple things. These are paper cups, and these are stacked plastic cups. These are straws. But using the seriality of an array to create a kind of spatial effect. And other artists that bring that into play, like Rachel Whiteread and her inversion of space, kind of making positive, negative space to actually begin to objectify space as an object. And the specific articulation of the forms that occur when that process begins to happen. And then Richard Serra, who again also I think embraces materiality, but is after a more spatial effect than he is an object-like quality. So for me, all those things add up to equal kind of material precedent. And so when I went about doing a book on material precedent for architects, the subtitle is actually The Typology of Modern Tectonics. There was a desire to think about how you could use precedent in a very methodical way and use analytical drawing in a very consistent unpacking of all these great precedents that exist. But from that, begin to try to elicit a trending, and from that trending, begin to understand the kind of innate interrelationships of the materials that we choose, the decisions that intrinsically come along with those materials, and how those decisions then begin to affect morphology and affect space and affect ultimately the kind of experience, the sort of most fundamental thing about architecture. The book, I mean, it opens with this Mies quote, which is very appropriate considering our environment here. But it says that each material has specific characteristics in which we must understand it if we want to use it. In other words, no design is possible until the materials with which you design are completely understood. And Mies really felt that way, and his curriculum at IIT, his own practice was all incredibly materially driven. So much so that at IIT, literally your first year was wood and your second year was steel, and you went through materiality in a very precise way to begin to understand the relationship of tectonics, of materiality, and architecture, all as a synthetic kind of relationship. So the book, which I won't really belabor, I'll kind of go through quickly because in many ways it's not bedtime reading. Well, maybe it is. It'll push you to sleep, I think. But it's meant almost as a kind of reference text because it takes some time to actually spend with the book a little bit. The basis is pretty simple. There are 6 material categories that are identified. So wood, masonry, concrete, metal, glass, and plastic. Then in each category, there are 8 precedents that are each chosen. They're really focused in 20th century sort of modernity in terms of the kind of evolution of it. But they really span the last 100 years and try to talk about the kind of progressive evolutions of materiality and what the implications are. Then there's a series of categories. The first is simply kind of documentation. So there's a kind of a plan, section, elevation, and axonometric. And then across them, there's a series of different categories and ultimately then subcategories. So from structure and form across, and then the kind of subcategories of primary and secondary, et cetera, et cetera. And in this catalog, then, each building is consistently kind of mapped out as it moves across, and then ultimately resolves in a kind of detail. So a plan detail, section detail, elevational detail, and axonometric detail. There's a kind of dashboard that moves with you that gives you the kind of basic information of cost and duration of where things are located geographically. It tries to speak towards programmatic types and gives kind of basic material palette. But the goal is really to try and give this comparative diagramming of how things begin to work. And what it does is it translates material decisions back to other larger design decisions in the project, so that you begin to see a kind of reciprocity between, for example, skin and structure, between how a building meets the ground and an attitude about materiality and durability. And so in each of these studies, the kind of overarching spread gives you a kind of dramatic overview, a kind of simultaneity of drawings. So despite the fact that there's a series of them, they're meant to be seen, again, both laterally and vertically, to give these kinds of interrelationships and kind of relativisms. As you move through it, then, you move through each of the material types. And so there's kind of subfamilies within it. So within concrete, you can begin to see a kind of evolutionary process. But it's also chronologically arranged. So you begin to see how the sort of technology begins to evolve, and about how these landmarks begin to kind of emerge in each one of these progressions, and what the implications are in terms of form and in terms of the actual kind of material articulation. And ultimately ends with plastic, right, a kind of most emergent. So that's kind of the first section of the book. The second section of the book then takes each one of those spreads and makes those drawings much, much larger, and actually superimposes the diagram on the base drawing, so that there's a much more kind of precise legibility. And I apologize for the projector. You can't see them too well, but there's a precise legibility about the interrelationship of how these things work, and about how the specific sensibility of the detail begins to apply itself to that kind of larger architectural project. Again, it's that relationship between what's existing and then the reading and the kind of conceptual underpinning of how those things become legible. And from it, what it does is it really begins to unpack each localized building, but again, begins to illustrate these larger trends towards what's happening in the project as a whole. And then the third part really is where the sort of words actually start to show up, but it begins to do a kind of relative comparison. So it begins to take the materials themselves and begins to take themes across those materials and arrange them in a relativism. So they're chronologically arranged, but then there's, again, the diagramming begins to have a kind of parallel sort of textual explication, both of the primary theme, but then more specifically going through each project and talking about how it develops specifically its underpinning conceptual and material interrelationships. So it's a very kind of dense text. So for example, here, material to ground. This is about how buildings begin to meet the ground and what the role and relationship of those things are. And you can see that through a material understanding, you can unpack an entire kind of theoretical, conceptual, cultural, economic decisions that were made and are embedded in the project itself. But that, again, I think the materiality begins to breed a kind of inroad into. So by the time you've gone through this sort of total text, you begin to understand all the kind of interrelationships of systems, again, both within a project, but then also within a kind of a theme, and also within a material itself. So this book really, again, served as a kind of catalog, but was one that was, for me, kind of anterior in terms of looking at precedent, right? Which is, I think, essential for any architect at any stage of their career, to begin to look at our colleagues and community, look at history and contemporary practice with a kind of critical, but also a kind of evenness to it. But there was a desire, again, as an emerging practitioner, to begin to think about, well, what does materiality really mean now for my generation? And what does it mean in kind of contemporary practice, where in many ways the rules are starting to change a bit, right? Again, being schooled at a time where, I guess we're kind of post-digital, where sort of the computer is just an integrated aspect of our lives. Fabrication and digital fabrication is something that's just kind of natural in terms of what we're able to do. It's no longer necessarily a destination in its own right, and simply as a tool that we have at our disposal. So it becomes a question of, okay, so where do we begin to look? And Michael Meredith and I co-chaired a conference called Material Matters about a year and a half ago, which was being held at USC and was incredibly well received. We had all kinds of people show up, and what was really interesting is that it really struck a vein, I think, with, again, a kind of certain generation of practice that was really dealing with these issues in a very, very similar way. And it kind of developed in a way a real kind of community that was not localized. It was sort of geographically dispersed all over, but were all these people doing things and thinking about things in a very, very similar way. So Michael and I proposed a book to Routledge, which is called Matter. It's Material Processes in Architectural Production, and is actually the second book, which will be out in May. And what it does is it takes 25 different emerging firms, and we asked each one of these practitioners to pick a project and present that project in a very theoretical manner, in a very technical manner, and in a very graphic manner, all kind of simultaneously, and all circulating around this idea and role of materiality in their firms and how they make things. And so we went to all kinds of great people, and they came back with these really fantastic essays. This is a map which is incredibly small, but it actually it's all the participants and like when they were kind of born, where they were educated, how our paths have all crossed, where they now teach, what they're doing, etc., major awards and things that have overlapped. And then Michael, being at Harvard on the East Coast, and I was at USC on the West Coast, we each interviewed a series of who we kind of see as parents to our generation in a way, people who've been thinking about materiality or simply thinking about representation or not thinking about materiality, but have been really influential. So I interviewed Neil Denari and Michael Maltzin, and he interviewed Stan Allen and Nader Tarani and Toshiko Mori and Michael Bell. So we had a variety of these people all talking about their perception of what the role of materiality is and what it meant to them, but also what it means to this generation. So I'll just run through a few of these people very, very quickly. But Andrew Cutlass at CCA, this is he does a series of fabric casting techniques that develop these kinds of very beautiful but very controlled surfaces. This is an installation at San Francisco MoMA. Jeremy Fika, who's at Carnegie Mellon, who's dealing with these ceramics, but mills these very complicated and, again, parametrically controlled molds that allow for essentially load-bearing units, but they're, again, designed to optimize airflow and deal with self-shading skins. John Enright and Margaret Griffin Enright, also on the faculty at USC, but installations that they have done in different places, one dealing with grass, actually, as the American lawn, another, but both dealing with the kind of specific sort of morphology and a relationship of how that form is made through material. Howler Yoon at MIT, and Eric Howler and Meijin Yoon. Meijin's at MIT and Eric's at Harvard. This is a new project that they're doing, actually. This is wind-controlled element. These things rotate, so you can see here the kind of optical effects that begin to happen. This is one of the early prototypes. but they deal with again, form making and effect making through an active, interactive system. Iwamoto Scott, this is Lisa Iwamoto and Craig Scott, both in the Bay Area. This was an installation they did called Voussoir Clouds at SciArc a year or so ago, but uses balsa wood, actually. These are all laser cut balsa wood that are folded and tabbed, but they create this incredibly strong kind of through the structural form finding. They create this very beautiful, but also structurally derivative environment. Andrew Atwood, who's also at USC, who actually is incredibly interested in process. He builds a series of these machines. He's actually right now building these machines. This one was a kind of 3D printer of sorts that sort of dripped. This kind of was all about making hair, basically. And it kind of, and also Jason Payne, who's at UCLA, who's also very interested in hair, of all things. But this is his house called a project called Raspberry Fields, but a small house that uses a shingling technique to create this really kind of magical surface. But again, interested in that role of materiality. And Euler Wu at SciArc, who have done a series of investigations into bent tubing here at a flexible roofing system at the LA Forum. Here, this was an installation in the SciArc gallery. So, and then I guess I'd like to talk about maybe the project that I included in that book, which came out of a kind of combination of two opportunities. One, which was the Borchardt Fellowship, which is a really wonderful thing, but a kind of hidden secret. It's this, it's sort of like the Rome Prize, except for you take away everybody else. They give you a large chunk of money, and they give you a chateau in northwestern France, and you go there for 6 months, and you live in this giant castle by yourself. You literally have your drawbridge, and you're on this lake, and it's a little bit The Shining in terms of being very, very isolated. But my interest at the time was in looking at Ledoux, and at the same time I was asked to do an installation at Materials and Applications, which is an experimental architectural gallery in Los Angeles that's done a series of large installations over the last decade. And so the two kind of came together, and the way of thinking about this view of history, about this view of Ledoux, who for me actually is one of the first people to be thinking about materiality in a modern sensibility of how we think about materials. The idea of objectifying materiality, of looking towards material processes for the generation of form. And this was part of a kind of larger research project, which I won't belabor you with. But there was really sort of two key components at the saltworks, right? Hopefully everybody knows Ledoux's famous saltworks. Let me go back. It's a kind of utopian town. It was built to harvest salt, and basically there were two things necessary to create salt, right? They needed salt water from which they could basically go through a drying process to extract the salt, and they needed fuel to create and feed these massive furnaces. And so it was determined that it was easier to move the ocean than it was to move the forest. So they went to this small town in eastern France and built this utopian city that was right at the edge of the largest natural forest in France. And then they channeled the water all the way to it, basically. And so there's a huge underlay of ideas about industrialism, of social engineering, and I won't speak towards all those. This was more an idea of looking at the idea of materiality. And here, Ledoux really looked towards the ideas and processes of the industrialized architecture, of the industrialized processes that the architecture was going to house as a generative mechanism for how he was making form. And is also an opportunity for where he introduces his interlaced column. And the project is marked by a very grand entry axis, again, which comes all the way through the kind of city and then into it. When one enters, there's a very controlled checkpoint. At the time, salt was was a commodity, even more precious than gold. And so everybody was checked, and when you left, your pockets were checked, because literally a handful of salt was like a handful of gold. So there was a military garrison that kind of controlled this checkpoint, and you entered through this very rough kind of mine, a simulation of a salt mine, into this very then controlled and classical environment. So you come through this Doric portico and you enter into the salt mine behind, which you can see here in these photos. And the idea of creating this this natural event, creating this again, this simulation of the experience, was a kind of beginning step towards actually trying to embrace the materiality and the process that it was dealing with. When one comes through, you then arrive at the kind of director's house, which is talked a lot about in terms of its panoptical qualities and the oculus eye of control. But for me, what was more interesting was the invention of Ledoux's interlaced columns. That idea of, to go back, you can barely see them here, I think I have a better picture, of this stacking of a perfect square and then a perfect circle, this interlacing that began to happen. And I argue that it's coming from the rawness of the kind of cut stone, and then a desire towards the purity of that referential column. And there's a desire to maintain the original shape and the sort of predicated, predicted geometry, both simultaneously, which creates then actually a third kind of oscillation of optical geometry. And then ultimately these series of windows, each one of them at the sort of urns that are tipping and spilling salt, and that have each kind of magically actually eroded over time, because the hypersalinated air actually becomes incredibly kind of corrosive and toxic to the limestone, and actually begins a kind of massive sort of deterioration to the surface. So in many ways, his kind of dripping and morphing that he was beginning to do was finished by the actual industrialization itself. So that project came, again, right at the same time with the project of materials and applications. And, being new to Los Angeles, and this being the first kind of project that I'd done on a sort of large public scale in Los Angeles, my interest in materiality and the idea of Southern California was one of really trying to engage a lot of the history of what's there, right? USC has these alumni, Frank Gehry and Tom Main. It's this school of Robert Irwin and lots of people in town all had very specific attitudes towards a materiality and towards, I think, a commonality of materiality that was intriguing to me. And so the idea of taking on an installation was predicated in some material choices. The first of which actually derived from a chain link and ultimately kind of evolved into very, very simple EMT tubing, electrical metal tubing that's readily available and very inexpensive. And the other was plastic, PVC, and actually using a pneumatic structure to actually think about an air-inflated and air-supported structure. So the project began with these two pieces, a kind of front piece, which actually, again, emerges, both projects emerge out of very specific geometries. And the first relying upon triangulation, so three-sided geometry, and the back relying upon four-sided geometry. The front, which is about line, the back, which is about surface. The front, which uses a double dome structure, so there's an inner dome and an outer dome. And then the back, which uses descriptive geometry, a cone that meets into a bent barrel vault that culminates in an absidial relationship, and then an entry cone that merges into that space. But the goal was really one, again, more of experience. So the project is called Light Frames because it's really about how these two objects begin to work as experiential generators. The one in front begins to cast shadow and creates this very kind of dynamic second figure on the site and on the surfaces around it. While the second figure begins to project light and creates these very specific moments of projections. So they're inversions of one another in terms of how they begin to deal with optics. And their relationship was one of beginning to deal with almost like two strangers in an elevator in a way, this kind of quiet awkwardness between them and kind of the interrelationship of how they could begin to work. So the front structure was actually developed in collaboration with Bureau Happel. We actually developed some very complicated feedback mechanisms about how we could structurally do this. We were trying to optimize things so that the structure was really right at the breaking point. We wanted it to be kind of flimsy. We were actually very worried about people climbing all over this thing. And so it was sort of meant to be right at the kind of point of optimization, which actually ultimately created a pretty rational, there's sort of a banding that begins to happen, a kind of small piece size, a kind of medium piece zone, and then a large piece zone. And it all came down to really the slenderness ratios of the tubes and how we could really maximize them. So we went back and forth with a series of models. Sorry, this is very light on the left. A series of models that were looking at the stress, and we were trying to really optimize the structure in terms of maintaining the experiential formal qualities, but also creating a kind of density to them. The pieces were very simply kind of developed. It uses a straight cut tube that has a kind of insert to it. Then there's a crimping that happens. There's a grinding that allows for rotation to it. And then there's a drilling that happens. And then a bending at the joint. And then the same thing happens at the other end, but with the rotation to it. So the variation of length, the variation of the angle of bend, and the relative rotation of the two pieces actually allowed for kind of incredible sort of flexibility to it. So that was kind of the front structure that you begin to kind of enter under. And again, it became all about the joints, and so there was a very kind of complicated model that it was not just about the position of the joints, but also the sequencing of the pieces so that there wasn't any kind of interference from one piece to the next. And so we developed a series of scripts that helped us kind of extract information as well as embed information in this model. And then there was a lot that had to deal with the idea of how we were going to fabricate this thing. So we prefabricated it at USC in chunks, and then those chunks had to kind of be delivered to site. And there was questions of how we could optimize and minimize the labor, because there was this, there's over 365 joints in the whole thing, and so there was a desire to reduce that. And so we got it down to about 25 on-site joints that actually had to merge. The back piece, again, as I mentioned, again uses a kind of conical geometry that goes again into that barrel vault and into an apse. It's air inflated. It has a constant air supply to it. So it was a double shelled system that allowed for air to actually exist between the two shells. But then the need to hold those together allowed for the introduction of a series of oculuses that work both as effectual windows. They vary in their angle as they go up, so that when one is centered in the space, that you can actually see directionally out each of the windows. But then they also stitch those walls together. And then there were a series of structural tapers, so you can see how the wall thickens from 6 inches down to almost 2 feet to give a greater kind of airflow as a support mechanism for the structure itself. Again, the primary geometries, it's really all formed out of almost pure descriptive geometries. And then there was a ribbing and a seaming that all had to happen based on the vinyl dimensions, both in terms of the width of the rolls that it came in, as well as the lengths of how that could work. And then those cones, again, and how they begin to all operate and gradate in terms of their scale. So this was all done through CATIA so that we could have a truly kind of parametric model that allowed for a kind of iteration, but again, beginning to pull out all these different things of geometries, of seams, of surfaces, inner and outer, cones, actual skins, etc. And then to further it, the outer skin was done with a translucent material, and the inner skin was done with a white, almost opaque vinyl, and the cones were done with the white. So when you're outside, you can begin to see the depth of the wall itself, but then when you're inside, you really focus on the light. And again, the way in which those windows began to alternate up the surface became really, really important. And so then it became a huge amount of just kind of being optimization became a kind of major thing. This exhibit, it had like a super shoestring budget. And so, we were all about trying to get to material efficiencies And we used a lot of nesting software to reduce any kind of waste and kind of optimize things. So there was a lot of templates that were made, and then nesting of those templates, and then some of the renderings of what the space was supposed to look like. The kind of Pantheon-esque Oculus, and the kind of inversion of the night view. So some of the models we did, we used a series of 3D printed models to be really precise about the kind of geometries, and went through a lot of sort of studies and sort of pinching of the shape to get it to fit on the site. Again, dealing with that inner shell versus the outer shell and how those things began to read. In early prototyping, just dealing with pneumatic structures, which was the first pneumatic structure I'd ever done. So these were very simple prototypes that were just done out of drop cloths, not the more expensive vinyl. But dealing with the kind of inflation. And then again, seeing, again, that idea of the projected light versus the cast shadow. So fabrication happened this summer. I had a great group of students that worked with me this summer to help fabricate things. We went through a series of tests and about how inserts, we ended up putting neoprene gasket in there to increase that joint strength. And then it became about how you manufacture all these things and then really label and maintain them as each one is a kind of separate piece. And then prefabricating the chunks, we sort of nested these things all in this chapel storage space at the School of Architecture before we hauled them up there. But beginning to see some of the shadow effects that began to happen and how those joints began to operate, etc. And then the other team that was doing the vinyl, we used two welding processes. We used a thermal weld, a heat weld, where elements were in lateral tension. And then we use a chemical weld when they're in vertical tension. So when it was perpendicular to the surface, we needed to use a chemical weld, but when it was along the surface, we could use a heat weld. And it created kind of different processes and different kind of finishes to the surface. And so then it became about wrestling this kind of giant bag and all its kind of different things. And then we sort of plugged in these blowers, and it begins to kind of inflate and grow. Ultimately, the on-site fabrication became a big issue. So this was about the phasing of the 5 chunks. And the inflatable itself, we wanted to have a presence. So we actually ended up putting a very light frame in to hold it in place so that if you were in it and the power went off, you wouldn't be trapped in this giant blanket. But it actually has this great kind of weird breathing quality. So when you walk into the site, there's a motion detector that kicks on and the blowers come on and it kind of puffs up and then stays inflated for 10 minutes and then goes off. So it was all about the way in which we could be as minimal as possible on the site. The piece touches down in 3 major points, and its lightness, actually, the biggest issue was really uplift. We had a massive cantilever because it came from 2 front legs to a kind of back wall. And so in the back, we used a kind of earth screw that was basically a big kind of auger that went down about 3 feet. And then in the front, we just were able to anchor into an existing concrete slab. And so then with students, we hauled these things on this truck and drove them through Los Angeles, kind of Cannonball Run style, and got them on the site, and then we began to kind of wrestle them up. And you can see the narrowness of this infill site. A lot of the difficulties came from kind of trying to build this ship in a bottle sort of thing. So these were some of the phasing. This was super stressful over the last 3 weekends. In fact, this opens this Saturday, so you're seeing it before anybody. So if you're in Los Angeles, come out on Saturday. But this was on the first weekend. We kind of got everything up and in its first places in terms of the piece. On the second weekend, we were finishing off a lot of the bolting, and we began to sort of hoist up the inflatable into place, and then began to kind of puff it up. Again, we're doing everything on the cheap, so it's all like borrowed ladders from facilities, and everything was a little kind of ghetto. But we got it done pretty well. So, but in the end, it works really well. So here it is, kind of deflated on the right. The piece and how it begins to work. So these kinds of complicated joints. You can see here the outer dome and the inner dome, how those things begin to work. That kind of double density of what it produces, and then the kind of, again, that projected moire effect on the surface, and then the weird kind of puffiness and kind of awkwardness of that air-inflated structure in the oculus on the right, that kind of beauty. You can begin to see how light begins to project and the kind of relationship of the two. So again, this massive kind of cantilever that goes over and allows you to enter. And again, the effects, I was up on a ladder, so I took this with my iPhone. But the light effects, again, the reflective effects, the projective effects, and then the cast effects are really wonderful. So I'm going to stop there, and I will certainly invite everybody, if you're in Los Angeles, it will be out through March, but again, this weekend we have a DJ and beer and all kinds of good stuff, so I encourage you to come. But again, the talk was really trying to just talk about materiality, how to be projective, but also how to be, a practitioner that deals with materiality as an instigating element. So, thank you.
Please ask questions
if you want.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have to say I want to wrap myself in that inflatable
Yeah.
right now because it's freezing in here. But that was a great talk. It was impressive to see the array of the work in the book, which I want to see in real life outside. I had a question about I think what was your fourth slide, which I think may have offered an inadvertent cautionary tale, and I just want to get back to it, where it was the slide that showed when modernism reached out far beyond itself
too utopian. Yeah.
and got too utopian, and that sort of, so it's this rise and fall of modernism as a result. And I couldn't tell whether that was a sort of warning of having too big a project will hurt you, and so think more about materiality in a way that's closer to the project, or whether you meant that kind of message.
I think, in a way, actually, I think that slide was maybe more cautionary for me and maybe for my generation in a way, because I do feel like, a lot of the projects I showed were very small from the Matter book. They're very small, they're very experimental, they're often temporary or non-functional in a kind of traditional sense. They don't have to work as buildings in a longer term. And so, the idea of them becoming indulgent is something to worry about, but also the idea of losing the ability to translate that into a building that is much more laden with other responsibilities in terms of building codes and clients and budgets and weathering and all these other things in a much larger sense. I have great admiration for the modernist projects, but I do think that the holistic buy-in to almost any one thing can lead you on a path of unevenness in a way, in terms of looking at a broader spectrum of issues and really thinking about all the issues that have to happen. I do think materiality is a really, really important thing, because as an educator, it happens to me all the time. I teach a material studio, and it still happens all the time, where you're on a student's review, and you've been working on a building for 2 months, and you're like, well, what's it made out of? And they're like, I don't know, concrete or steel. And it drives me to the wall, because I'm like, really? Is this where we are? There's just no understanding about that translation of idea to object. And for me, that's so peculiar, because it's like what you start with, understanding how something is made and the difficulties of working with that has so much information in it that just seems so essential to how we begin to operate as designers. And so, in that sense, I think it's that remaining back to the essentialism of physicality. Not just that, if you use a material right, that's good enough. There's still poetic things about architecture with light and space and experience that I think trump everything else we ever talk about. But it is a quest, I guess, for a way of embracing those things. And it was something that I kind of actually developed out of my thesis at Harvard, but a phrase, the idea of celebrating the inevitable, of really trying to, I guess it's kind of a jujitsu thing of you use your enemy's weight against them. The inevitable things that are going to come up, that you embrace those things, and they don't become a pox on your house when you have to put an exit sign on the wall. That it becomes an opportunity. And so, how do you begin to do that and find a way that it can integrate in a sort of synthetic sensibility?
I really applaud the thoughtfulness of the last project that we just saw. But I wonder if there was some kind of discussion about the life cycle of some of these materials. Like, for example, vinyl.
Right.
It's incredibly toxic to create.
Right.
It's almost impossible to get rid of in a safe way. So tell us if there was a discussion of
No, there absolutely was.
It's very inexpensive, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah, there absolutely was, and both of them have kind of second lives beyond this. So yeah, there's actually a person in Los Angeles that wants that to have for kind of parties. They're going to inflate in their yard from time to time. So believe it or not, it actually had a second life, and I was like, okay, all right. And then the conduit, actually, the desire is actually for it to be iterative because it has now a kind of array. And so we've been working actually on software that allows you to use the same standardized pieces but develop variant forms. And so it can kind of, it's like a cell, it can kind of divide and make sort of sub issues. So there was definitely a lot of thought about that, and there was a lot of consideration about waste during the process, and there's very, very little waste. Again, we went through optimizations on almost all those kinds of surfaces to nest everything. So the windows all fit, the oculi became patches and corner pieces, et cetera, and so I mean, I'd like to argue that was from a sustainable agenda. It totally was, but it was also from an economic one. Like it was just, we didn't have any money, and so it was like the amount of trying to maximize the material to things was really, really essential. So, I mean, that's a huge issue. It's one that in any temporary structure, I think, becomes even more like of an issue. Like, what do you do with it? And there's a lot of folks in the book actually that are colleagues that have done those kinds of things, and I've talked to them. Like Michael Meredith just did the PS1 last year, and I was like, "Well, what are you gonna do with it?" And he's like, "I'm gonna put it on eBay." But Tom Wiscombe did that. He did a beautiful installation at the Sire Gallery that was all aluminum, and he put it on eBay. So you assume people would at least like bid for the cost of the aluminum, right? So you can recycle it. Nobody did, so in the end he had to disassemble it and went to the recycling plant with it, kind of a thing. But so thinking about that holistic process is, I think, is an essential thing for sure. So, yeah. But I will say, all those drawings that Ron talked about, I actually just paid it 2 days ago, my annual storage facility bill. So some of these things will end up in a storage facility too, I'm sure. Well, thank you very much. I think there's going to be books for sale. I'm not selling